Facing a midlife crisis? Find courage in everyday women's stories. Subscribe to Resilient Women Rising.
Eleanor Grayson stood in her father's old workshop, the scent of oil and wood filling the air as the hands of a once broken clock ticked steadily for the first time in decades. At 47, she had spent years believing her life would remain as quiet and predictable as the small town of Ashwood, where she worked as a librarian. Never married, she had resigned herself to solitude, her only companion the memories of her father, a clockmaker who died when she was a child. But on a chilly October evening, a mysterious note hidden in that old family heirloom set her on a path that would unravel her past, challenge her fears, and lead her to a love she never expected. It began in Eleanor's modest apartment, where she sat sipping tea, the rain tapping against her window. The old clock on her shelf, a family heirloom that hadn't worked since her father's death 35 years. Ago suddenly let out a sharp talk. Eleanor froze. The hands, stuck at 317 for decades, twitched to 318. A faint whirring followed, and a hidden compartment at the base popped open, revealing a folded note in her father's handwriting. "Ellie, if you're reading this, it's time. Find the workshop. The truth is waiting." Her pulse quickened. The workshop, her father's clockmaking shed, had been locked since his death, its key supposedly lost. According to her mother, who had grown distant over the years, Eleanor grabbed her coat and drove to her childhood home on the edge of town. Her mother was away visiting relatives, leaving the house dark and silent. In the backyard, the shed stood like a forgotten relic, its windows boarded, its door sealed with a rusty padlock. Eleanor hesitated, then recalled the key her father had worn around his neck. She'd seen it in a box of his belongings in her mother's attic. After a hurried search, she found Ida, small, ornate key with a clock face etched into its bow. Back at the shed, the key turned with a satisfying click, and the door groaned open. Inside, dust motes floated in the beam of her flashlight. The workshop was frozen in time tools scattered on the workbench, half-finished clocks lining the shelves. In the center stood a large, intricate clock, its face adorned with tiny carved figures. A note was pinned to it, "Wind me, Ellie. Start at the beginning." She turned the key and the clock whirred to life, gears grinding, figures spinning. Then her father's voice echoed from within, soft and crackling, as if recorded on a hidden mechanism. "Ellie, I'm sorry I left you so soon. There's something I couldn't tell you then. Follow the clues. You're stronger than you know." Tears welled in her eyes, but curiosity drove her forward. The clock's hands pointed to 600, and a drawer slid open, revealing a map of Ashwood with a red X on the town square. Beneath it, another note: "The fountain holds the next step." The next morning, Eleanor stood by the square's old fountain, its stone basin weathered and mossy. She searched until she found a loose brick behind, which was a small tin box containing a brass gear and a riddle. "Where the books sleep, the third shelf keeps." As a librarian, she knew exactly where to look: the library. At work, she slipped into the history section, her fingers brushing the third shelf. A hollow thud led her to a false book titled The Clockmaker's Tale. Inside was a letter from her father. "Ellie, I was working on something big, a clock that could track more than time. I hid it to protect you. Find Daniel Pierce. He'll know the rest." Daniel Pierce. The name stirred a memory. He'd been her father's apprentice, a quiet man who'd left town after the funeral. A quick search revealed he now ran a repair shop 2 towns over. That afternoon, Eleanor drove to meet him. Daniel, 50, had dark hair, streaked with gray, and hands scarred from years of tinkering. He looked up from a watch he was fixing, his expression softening. "Eleanor, you look just like him. I need your help," she said, showing him the gear and letter. What was my father hiding? Daniel sighed, setting his tools down. "Your dad was a genius. He built a clock called the Chronos. It could predict patterns like weather or events. but he feared it'd be misused, so he dismantled it and hid the pieces. I promised to keep his secret. Why now? She asked. He said you'd find it when you were ready. Seems he was right. With Daniel's guidance, Eleanor followed more clues each, a piece of the chronos hidden in places tied to her father's life. The park where he'd taught her to ride a bike, the church where he'd married her mother. Each piece came with a recording of his voice, a message from the past. "You're my greatest creation, Ellie," he said in one. "This is your legacy, not just mine." But danger loomed. One night, a man in a dark coat cornered her outside the library. "Give me the pieces," he growled. "The chronos belongs in the right hands." She escaped, her heart racing, and told Daniel. He frowned. "Someone's been watching. We need to finish this." The final piece was in the workshop, hidden in the large clock. When Eleanor assembled the chronos, it hummed to life, its face glowing with shifting patterns. Her father's last recording played Ellie, "Destroy it or keep it, your choice. I trust you." She stared at the clock, its power both alluring and terrifying. Could it predict her future, fill the emptiness of her single life? But she thought of her father's fear and her own resilience. With Daniel's nod, she smashed it, gears scattering across the floor. The man in the coat never returned. Perhaps he'd been a shadow of her doubts, or perhaps he'd given up. Either way, Eleanor felt unburdened. Months later, the workshop buzzed with new life, not from the chronos, but from Eleanor and Daniel. They'd started a clock repair business, blending her love of history with his expertise. Late nights spent fixing timepieces turned into shared laughter and quiet moments of connection. One evening, as they repaired an old pocket watch, Daniel brushed her hand and smiled. "You're braver than you think, Ellie." She smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Maybe I just needed the right time to find out. The once broken clock on her shelf now ticked steadily, repaired by her own hands. It wasn't magic, just a reminder that the past could lead to a future worth embracing. At 47, Eleanor had unlocked her father's legacy and, in doing so, found a love that made her feel truly seen.